TIAA is on a mission. Why? Because 54% of Black Americans don't have enough savings to retire. So in collaboration with big-name artists like Wyclef Jean, TIAA released Paper Right, new music inspiring a new financial future. With 100% of streaming sales going to a nonprofit that teaches students how to invest. Stream Paper Right now and help close the gap.
Hello, Beat Check listeners. I'm Gosia Wozniacka, and I'm the environmental justice reporter at The Oregonian. Today, I'm with Dr. Thomas Joseph Doherty, a Portland psychologist who focuses on helping clients overcome anxieties linked with climate change. And today, we're going to be talking about the mental health impacts of the January storm, and more generally, the mental health impacts of environmental disasters and extreme weather linked to climate change. And we'll also specifically address how to deal with climate-related fears and anxieties in a healthy and hopefully constructive way. So let's get started. Welcome to the show, Dr. Doherty. Thanks for taking the time to speak with us.
Thanks, Gosia. I'm really glad to be here.
So we just experienced a major winter storm, or a series of snow, ice, and windstorms that lasted over a week, resulted in an almost complete shutdown of our city. We saw massive trees fall and crush cars, power poles, split people's home in half. We saw people killed by falling trees, electrocuted by power lines, dying from hypothermia. We saw tens of thousands of people with power outages in our metro area. And I'm wondering what the emotional toll of experiencing and witnessing such extreme weather is on human beings, and what kind of emotions do events like this bring up in us?
Yeah, that's a great question. Whenever I start thinking about this, I go back to some of the research that I've been involved in psychology regarding issues like climate change and environmental issues. And, if you step back a little bit, there's three ways that a big kind of abstract issue like global climate change can affect our mental health. If you want to simplify it, there's three kinds of baskets of impacts. The first kind of impact is actually disaster impacts, storms, droughts, floods, things like that, or this ice storm, and that causes injury, it causes deaths, it causes property destruction, and that's a fairly easy category for people to understand. It's acute, it's right in your face. And then another category of impacts is what disaster experts would call indirect impacts. And those are impacts that stem from the original disaster that might happen, after the disaster or somehow related to the disaster, such as, the long-term rebuilding and problems that would happen if you lost your house or your car, dealing with all the financial issues, the health issues, injuries, recovery, and also indirect issues. Say your business was closed and you lost money from that. Say a restaurant lost its business. So there's economic issues, employment issues, all kinds of ripple effects from disasters that people might not automatically think about, but that really affect us. Sometimes more than the disaster itself. Sometimes those indirect impacts are actually much more debilitating. Say if your business goes bankrupt, or say a farmer or someone who works on the land loses their crop, and that tends to tie in with other social issues that already exist in other stressors, right? The farther away you get from the kind of epicenter from the disaster, the more complex it gets, because you're getting into society and things like that. And the third category is just the emotional impacts of sitting and experiencing something like this, even if you weren't injured at all, or your house didn't have a tree fall on it or something like that. And that's a real source of impacts as well. And that's something, when I was doing research, say a decade ago or more, people were thinking, oh, that's an interesting idea. But with the advent of climate disasters and things happening around the world, people have experienced this. So that leads to the kind of fear of what if this happened to me, or, my concerns about people who have been injured or killed, or my concerns about all the trees, if someone's really connected with nature and they go to Powell Butte Park or something like that, and they see these trees falling down, massive trees falling down, and they feel bad. So there's kind of three three ways, and that's kind of a good broad way to start, and then it helps people to kind of figure out what's most meaningful for them.
Right. And so this emotional basket is one that I feel like we don't really pay very much attention to. But it sounds like, the sort of emotions that you're mentioning, fear, anxiety, I don't know if there's others. There are those things, can they impact people in a significant way?
Sure. I mean, the first two categories are more official. Like I can use my homeowner's insurance to deal with some of these things, or there's laws and rules about some of the stuff, or policies. But the emotional pain and loss, the emotional suffering is harder to quantify, and it's often not it's just not a part of our system. If a tree's destroyed in the park, even if I see that tree every day for 20 years in my daily walks, I have no official ownership or power with that tree. And so those losses tend to be what's called disenfranchised losses. Like they're losses that happen, but there's not an official way to mourn or grieve them. And so people often kind of keep them to themselves, or they just kind of linger under the surface. And so that's one of the insidious things of any kind of big issue is the unacknowledged, unrecognized, unmourned losses. And that of course is a big part of issues around the natural environment. So loss of a species, loss of trees, loss of seasons, loss of familiar weather, all those kinds of things.
Right. And then also just watching, whether it be your home, your neighbor's home, or watching it on the news of all these crushed houses, crushed vehicles, overturned poles, blocked streets, et cetera, that we, watched for a week or 2 weeks over and over and over. I mean,
yeah. And that's an important point, because the media, the modern instantaneous media that we have versus, the news and information and social media really can amplify certain issues. There was interesting research done after the 9/11 bombings of people being feeling traumatized and having post-traumatic stress symptoms, even far away from the disaster and having no personal connection with the disaster. But one of the mediating factors was their news intake and how often they had watched really troubling videos. And so it's just something for our self-care to be aware of. What we take in, our media diet, can really affect our mental health. I mean, there's research that even shows what people watch on TV influences how they think about society. For example, there's much more crime and disasters and kind of bad people represented on television than in the actual world, and so people tend to then transfer some of their thoughts that they pick up from entertainment and apply it to the world. So point being is that, yes, these trees have fallen, and it's a very terrible, sad, and troubling situation, but relatively they're quite rare, given all of the trees in the city. As you know, these incidents are quite rare. So we also have to do a little mental balancing to realize physically our body is obviously scared about a huge tree falling on you, but the odds of something like that happening are incredibly rare. It's more, the odds of having a house fire or getting in a car accident is much, thousands of times greater than a tree falling. But it's both and. So that's the challenge. We do have to. I mean, I have a large spruce tree in my backyard in Northeast Portland, and I have checked it and have had arborists look at it, and that's of course a responsible thing to do if you have trees on your property. But it also makes me think about it. So there is a reality principle that we have to honor. That we do have to check on these things, but we also have to rein in our emotional reactions if they're kind of running too much. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I'm sure pretty much every Portlander did what I did, which is look around my house and see where the big trees were and what their trajectory could be if they fell. So, yeah, it's very interesting what you're what you're saying. And speaking of trees, it really struck me that trees are very symbolic in some ways. And watching them unfold on such a massive scale, which, again, is relative because only, let's say, over 1,000 trees fell, and we have millions of trees, but still it's a lot of trees and a lot of large trees. And trees and humans are inextricably linked. We've depended on trees for security, tool making, food. We have a physical and spiritual connection to trees. And then in our region, especially, they're very symbolic. It's a region that was timber dependent, beautiful trees that we love. And so I wrote a whole story about trees and what it means when these trees that we love start to hurt us. And it kind of struck me that, I wanted to ask you whether watching these massive, beautiful trees fall, is it kind of a reminder of our fragility and of our own mortality?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Like you say, trees have all kinds of actual and symbolic value. I mean, there's an interesting thing that I talk about in my work with people regarding environmental psychology, and it's this idea of our environmental identity. So it's our identity in relation to nature and the natural world. And it's thinking about your environmental identity is very similar to thinking about other kinds of identity you might have. You might have a certain identity as a person, like your gender identity, your sexual identity, your racial or ethnic identity, your regional identity. We're talking about a kind of regional Pacific Northwest identity that people understand what that is. But we have an environmental identity. That's our own unique sort of way we think about ourselves in relation to nature, and how closely we're related to trees and other animals. And some people have a very close emotional bond with nature and the natural world, or with trees, sometimes with specific animals or trees or places, places they love, their pets, or just all, the web of life, the other species. And they see their self in nature as being fairly interconnected, or even sort of overlapping. Right. So for someone like that, it's a personal loss. It's a personal loss to lose a tree. Other people might see it more as it's a sadness, but it's just a tree and there are thousands of trees and I'm not personally attached to it. So there's different versions of environmental identity. Obviously, there's a huge history of timber harvesting in the Pacific Northwest, and people that make their living off of, growing and cutting down trees. So there's different beliefs. But so to understand people's impacts from a disaster like this, it's helpful to think about their environmental identity, because that will predict a lot about how you feel. And then people have all kinds of environmental values that kind of go along with their identity. So people have, identity, or they have values about right and wrong, moral values, like what is good, like is it good to save a tree, or is it unjust for the trees to be falling down? Or they have symbolic values, what trees represent, or aesthetic values about beauty in nature, or scientific values. They get really interested in, what happened with these trees. Well, it sounds like, climate stressors maybe have affected the tree roots, and they'll kind of do the science about what happened with these trees and why, which I find interesting, why more trees fell recently. Could be a combination of many factors. The weather patterns over the last couple of years really weakening some root systems for trees, and then the heavily soaked ground from the wetness, and then the snow, and then, the ice, all that kind of unique configuration of things that happened.
Yeah. And it's just a symbol, I think, because they're so large. It's not a little mouse species or a little butterfly that, we rarely see that disappeared because of climate change. These are these giant trees that tower over the environment, and here they are falling down. So I think it's maybe the size too, for me.
Yeah, no, the size, literally. Trees are meant to be long lasting.
Right. Yeah, and they look so strong.
Strength.
Right?
Yeah,
exactly.
And practically, It's one thing intellectually to talk about all of this, to talk about disasters, for example. It's another thing to go through a disaster. So we could talk about a forest fire, for example. It's another thing to actually be
Right.
in a forest fire.
Right.
The sound, the wind, the heat is scary and overwhelming. I've done a lot of outdoor things in my life, and I happen to have been in the woods when big trees have fallen. And when a big tree falls in the woods, you can hear it for miles, right? It's a huge thing. So you can imagine, I mean, this is a little troubling to imagine, but also imagine literally the sound and the weight and the ground shaking when a huge old growth, tree falls.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it is stupendous. And if you happen to live through that will be a life memory that you'll have for the rest of your life. And it could be obviously quite traumatizing if you had a near miss and someone you love was almost killed. So it's something to be taken seriously.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. One young woman that I interviewed described it as an earthquake because and it was a near miss. I mean, it was literally 2 feet from her that the tree fell on her house. And she thought it was an earthquake because she couldn't see what it was. And everything was shaking for some time. So, yeah. And I think, so this sort of leads me to ask you, this was a storm that people called unprecedented, but we're having more and more of these unprecedented weather events. Every year, as one of my interviewees said, every year is going to be unprecedented, is already unprecedented. And so what happens when we have these natural disasters or extreme weather events, heat domes, storms, over and over again, multiple times a year, every year? What does that do to our mental health? Like, what is the cumulative effect of this, of seeing these and being in the middle of these disasters? Because we're all experiencing the heat, we're all experiencing the ice, storm. So, do we need to sort of recalibrate how we take these events in because they're just repeating over and over and over?
Yeah, I think we do. So this is about our kind of, to stay with the environmental identity idea, we have to modify our environmental identity a bit, because what we would think is quote unquote normal weather isn't normal. There is a new normal. And part of one of the dangerous things about climate change is that it's a new unknown normal. So it's difficult to predict exactly what is going to happen. It's difficult to predict what's going to happen. And so not only do we have to make room for different weather patterns, unpredictable, erratic winter weather, or changes in the seasons, we have to make room for a big gray area about what that will actually entail. So there's a lot of mystery involved here. So if we step back, it helps. One way I think this can affect people is to get more serious about dealing with climate change, because these abstract ideas about climate disruptions, this is it. Like I tell people, you want to know what climate change is, just look around, because we're in it. This is the climate change that scientists have been warning us about. It's happening around us. These kinds of storms, and it is impacting people, and so that hopefully will prompt more action to mitigate some of the causes. I mean, at this point, we really have to take action on adapting, adapting to a changed system. And I'm sure this storm will lead to different policies and people being more careful about things. But psychologically, yes, it is a shifting baseline in what our expectations are. Oddly enough, people can get used to most anything, so we will get habituated to this kind of thing, and we already have. Really, if you step back, people have already become used to more question marks about weather and planning and things like that. And this is both good and bad. I mean, people have. I know myself, even I have. Kind of low-grade PTSD from the heat dome and from fires. And so at certain times of the year, I'll be really apprehensive about the weather. And, Labor Day, I'll always be thinking about where are the winds and how's the weather and things like that. So we do have these kind of lingering reactions that are unpleasant, but it also empowers us. Like we're smart and we learn and we keep growing and evolving.
Right.
And, so part of this work is always coming back to, this is a teachable moment. I can have a growth mindset. I can learn about this. I can apply my skills, so it's easy to become very disempowered about all this sort of stuff. And once you give people a chance to express their feelings, often they'll sort of pick themselves up and start naturally problem solving. But it helps to sort of recommit to having a good mindset and, focusing on what we can do in our actions and things like that.
Got it. Now, you've dedicated your entire practice to helping people deal psychologically with the impacts of climate change. You're one of a small but growing number of psychologists and therapists nationwide who focus on this specifically, on climate. And so I'm wondering if you could give me a few examples without breaching any confidentiality rules of what type of issues do clients seek to resolve in sessions with you? Like when they come to see you, a climate psychologist, a climate therapist, what do they come with? Is it just anxiety about a storm, or is it a wide array of issues connected to climate?
Yeah, I would say it's a wide array. If I step back a little bit, I'm trained as a clinical psychologist, but before I became a psychologist, I used to do outdoor work. I did wilderness guiding, and I was a professional river guide. I worked for Greenpeace. So I had some experience with environmental work and with just people's connections with the outdoors. In fact, one of the reasons why I became a psychologist was I was really curious about all the positive aspects of people's connections with nature and the things I had seen in some of these outdoor trips. So a lot of my early connections here were quite positive. But along the way, I learned about climate change and was a part of some research about climate change and mental health that kind of led me into this focus now. So it's not something I've necessarily chosen to do. It's something that's kind of chosen me. And I'm working on a manuscript right now, a book for the public about coping. So I am, for better or for worse, immersed in this now.
Yeah.
But in my psychology practice, in my counseling practice, I've seen a variety of clients over the years, and I still see some of my long-term clients that aren't necessarily focused on climate. But recently, in the last 3 or 4 years, particularly in the last 3 years, the idea of people having eco-anxiety and climate concerns has really, exploded around the world because of events and things like that. And so,
yeah, eco-anxiety. So that's kind of a new term. So what do people come to you with?
Well, eco-anxiety is actually not it's not a scientific term. It came out of the media. It was used to sort of describe people's concerns about the future. But, I think there's a number of ways this manifests for people. Sometimes people are specialists or professionals in conservation or in climate science or in disaster response, and they are dealing with fatigue, burnout, despair, disillusionment, and that's something that's helpful to talk through and to help them to restore their faith and regain their direction. Young people can be really concerned about the future. If you're an adult and you've lived for a while, you realize you've made it through various challenges over your life, and it's likely you'll be able to make it through future ones. But with young people, they're just coming onto the scene, so it's kind of scary time. And then all across the developmental spectrum, young children might, because they're very concrete thinkers, they might get really concerned about kind of abstract climate stuff. Young parents, people who are considering having children or have young children, will be having ethical questions about having children and how to best care for them. Elders, actually, if people they've lived a life of strong environmental awareness and values, they're prone to feeling really depressed or disillusioned or feeling concerned about their legacy, particularly if they work for years on environmental initiatives. So there's a lot of ways that this comes out for people. It's never separate from your life. We
Right.
always have our lives, so we have to deal with our relationships and our jobs and our self-esteem and our our everyday moods and things. Like I say, one of my catchphrases is we have issues and issues. So that we have capital I issues. Those are the big things we care about in the world. And we have our lowercase I issues, which is our stuff, which is our style, our strengths and weaknesses, our vulnerabilities, our neuroses, our traumas. So when I'm really working with someone, I'm trying to get them healthy in both ways. Like I want them to take on the things that are meaningful in the world for them. I want them to be a good citizen and to really take action in whatever way is meaningful for them. And part of a way to do that is to really get their own personal health in line, like really get clear. Like, are there certain reasons why environmental issues impact you? Is it because of your values? Is it because of something happened to you when you were a child? Is it because of your relationships? Is it because of your fears for your children? Like, what's the underlying reasons why you're sensitive?
It works together.
Yeah. And some of the underlying reasons where we care, there's a saying in therapy, we hurt where we care. So, if you're a listener that's impacted by the recent ice and snowstorm, that's because something you care about has been threatened, whether your values for yourself, your family, for your house, for your business, for the community, for trees, for other animals, something's been damaged. So, when we tap into our values, that can be a healthy part of this stuff. It helps things to make more sense.
That's a really interesting way of looking at it. Now, you just mentioned that you are working on a manuscript for a book about how to cope with climate anxiety. So most of us, most of our listeners and readers don't seek out climate therapists. You're probably one of the few climate therapists in the city. But, many people are concerned and anxious about climate change. And so I'm wondering if you could give our listeners some suggestions of what's a good way of dealing, with climate anxiety, fear, despair, and guilt that we all, carry in one, amount or another. How can people move forward given what's going on with climate warming?
Yeah, I think it's important to, what would I say? I think having some anxiety or concerns about climate change is entirely normal. It's an entirely normal. We know the best scientists and minds in our society have given us great data and reports about what's going on, and we see the evidence. And so there's no form. It's at a certain level, at a basic level, eco-anxiety is not a form of mental impairment. It's a form of being intelligent and being smart and being proactive. So we want to validate that. Anxiety is a useful and normal emotion.
Right.
It keeps us safe if there's a mysterious unknown threat, and it'll stop us from going into a bad situation, right? So anxiety is really our friend. Like, all our emotions are normal and our friends. We want to we want to honor the healthy part of anxiety, but we want to shrink the unhealthy part, which is like ruminating on anxiety or amplifying it, or kind of scaring ourselves or beating ourselves up by watching news over and over again, or going down internet rabbit holes, and doom scrolling. So we want to, like, as with all emotions, we want to find the healthy side, and we want to limit the downside. One way to do that is to actually have a whole range of emotions. Part of the problem with something like eco-anxiety is not the anxiety itself, is that there's no other emotions around it to balance it out. So I have this like metaphor of like an emotions party, right? So if I have an emotions party and only anxiety comes, that's not really a great party. But if I have curiosity come, and I have, compassion, and I have, even anger, or, sadness, or patience, other kinds of them, then I have more of a full range. So we want to try to express a full range of feelings. That then the sad feelings are allowed to just be themselves, and they do their work. So gratitude, curiosity, gratitude, patience, inspiration, those kinds of things, empowerment.
Yeah.
Again, even anger, like I said, getting angry is often seen as not healthy, but a little bit of anger is quite healthy because it helps us to stand up for ourselves and to take action.
Right. And you mentioned at the beginning that, these natural disasters are learning experiences where we are learning how to deal with them, how to better prepare both as individuals or families and as a community. So in a way, that's kind of a healthy energy that can light a fire under that preparation work.
Yeah. Yeah. And, many people seek out the help of friends or counselors or therapists, and it's perfectly fine to bring up your concerns about the weather or climate change with your therapist, because it's just one more thing of real life. You shouldn't feel some stigma about that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously a thing like the storm is, everyone's talking about it because everyone's affected by it,
Right.
the therapist just as well. That's what's unique about climate change, is that when we have the heat dome or smoke or fire evacuation warning, like therapists everyone's affected by it. So it's there's a great equalizing aspect of this. And then it's just important to bring up the social justice aspects here. Yes, everyone is affected, but not everyone is equally affected. So even this winter storm, like all disasters, will have the worst effects on people with least power, wealth, and privilege. So
Absolutely.
people that don't have a home, who are living outdoors, people that are renting or in kind of uneasy living situations, right?
With
And
fewer
so
resources to rent a
fewer
hotel room.
resources. Exactly. So there's a kind of a fairness and justice aspect to these things. Just something always to keep in mind, because we don't know what other people's lives are like. So we don't want to make assumptions about that.
Yeah. And I guess this sort of brings me to ask you whether, beyond preparing as individuals, whether we need to do more as communities to prepare for these climate change related weather events, and, prepare not just for, having supplies or batteries or things like that, but just prepare in a way that will safeguard really our mental health and well-being as people, and allow for I don't know, community hubs or some other ways that where people can be connected, because the human connection really is something that's helpful to people in climate disasters or natural disasters.
Yeah, exactly. I'm glad you brought up community, because one of the big problems of climate change and some of these issues, that it can really divide communities. Natural disasters and technological disasters. Natural disaster like a storm, and a technological disaster like a chemical spill or whatever. They can have different impacts. Some disasters really bring communities together. People help each other, and it's actually even if the disaster is difficult, it's a positive experience overall. That people bond, they help each other, they reaffirm their connections, and the community can emerge even stronger from it. And then other disasters really divide communities, particularly ones where there's some fault or some inequality, or some negligence, or where there's a big divide between the haves and the have-nots. And so that's where we have to be careful with the storm and with other events to come. Will it divide us as a community, or will it bring us together? And so that's a big, meta question. So I think, and there are things we can do to make those two outcomes. We can affect that by how we talk about it, by how we talk about the disasters, by how we accept other people's beliefs, by how we create systems so people feel like, the situation's fair. There's a lot of talk about, different permitting and fees around tree cutting and different things like that. And so this is an opportunity to make sure that policies are healthy and fair to people. educating people about the benefits of policy. So I think that's a big takeaway as a community for this disaster. And that's going to be a general question going forward. How is this event bringing us together, or how is it dividing us?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And we don't want to let politics and differences come between us in times like this. We want to work together. And then that translates to our personal lives too. Like, how can I get social support? Like you say, how can I work with other people proactively to work on prevention in the future, so I don't feel alone and isolated? So 2 big things going forward for people are having a sense of empowerment. Like, when I have some control over a situation or some action or ability, I feel better. And then I also feel better when I'm not alone or isolated. So now, taking action is not a magic bullet. It's not going to affect all of our angst. It's not going to get rid of all of our angst about climate or things like that. But it's certainly a very healthy thing to do going forward.
Absolutely. And there were great examples of neighbors helping neighbors in the storm, but I think we do have a long way to go still to prepare as a community and as individuals. So you host a podcast yourself, and it's called Climate Change and Happiness. And those 2 words don't often appear together. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about why you chose those 2 words to name your podcast, and how can people who cope with climate change stay happy, I guess.
Yeah. I do that podcast with a colleague of mine in Finland, actually, and he's an emotions researcher, and I talk about climate psychology. And the podcast is named that way on purpose, because it really begs the question about what does it mean to be happy in the modern world. And there was such a one-dimensional view about climate change that we want to look at all the different emotions and things that happen. So our podcast is actually fairly it's real. Like, we don't sugarcoat issues, but it's also upbeat, because we're always telling stories of people taking action and very inspiring things. So that's sort of the paradox of this. Once you get into it, and when you first get into climate or any of these issues, it's really grim and difficult and off-putting. But the more you stick with it, the more you start to find success stories and meet inspiring people that make it worth it. Even just doing this podcast with you makes me feel good to know that I'm taking part in a dialogue and people will listen. So, so anyway, that's part of it. So, there's no, climate change is a major public health global problem, and we should take action on it. But it shouldn't have the power to rob us of our happiness. There are many, if we are honest about our feelings and being in the moment, there are many things that are positive in the world, in our lives, things to be thankful for, things to enjoy. So one of the insidious problems with climate change is that it's really hampered people's kind of permission to feel happy, or to feel joy. And so we want to kind of try to reclaim that ability in an honest, ethical way, knowing that there are problems that we need to also take action on.
Well, thank you for doing that. I will be sure to link to your podcast in the episode notes, because I think many people will be interested in listening to that and to figure out how they can infuse a little more happiness into their lives despite the anxiety we feel. So one thing I think that you do bring up in your podcast and in your research is this concept of using the outdoors as therapy. I think it's a concept called ecotherapy. How does this work? If you can explain, how does this work in a situation like this, for example, with a storm where the natural world that's around us, including the trees, most recently, are potentially a menace that could hurt us. That it's hot outside, or it's icy outside, or the trees are falling. How do we use the natural world in a situation like that to heal us?
Yeah. Well, in general, and people know this just intuitively, but when we have contact with a safe, beautiful, healthy outdoor space. It's very healthy for us personally. It's good for our nervous system. It's good for our emotions. Being out in nature can give people time to think and reflect on their life, make big decisions, get a sense of where they are in the spectrum of their life. And there's like a dose response, effect. A 5-minute walk around the block during the workday can help me to clear my head and to, maybe have some insights about a problem I'm working on. But an afternoon or a day can really be a break or a rest. And I might take a retreat for a weekend or go to a beautiful place where I can get away and recharge. And obviously people have very special experiences when they spend a lot of time in nature, like out hiking for days or weeks, So there's a lot of positive things there. Many people have special places they go with their family, to the beach or to the mountains or to the desert. So that's one half of it. So that, ecotherapy, our outdoor therapy, is just kind of harnessing some of that. So that might be therapists that go walking with their clients, rather than sitting in an office, or therapists that, talk to clients about their outdoor experiences and help them to do more, to be more healthy. So that's part of that. It is a challenge. And I've seen this more recently where, because of damages to the environment or climate risks, that people do feel like their typical restoration has been threatened, like they don't feel comfortable. They feel grief or loss when they see drought or dying trees or something like that, or, obviously fires and smoke and things like that. So that's a major kind of learning experience for all of us. It's really about learning to be, we need to have compassion for ourselves and for the natural world. I mean, it's not the tree's fault or the earth's fault, the place's fault. So we need to learn to love places that are damaged, and we need to realize that life takes many, many forms. So it's kind of an invitation for us to grow up a little bit, as people, to realize nature isn't always just there for me.
Right. And that it's changing.
It's changing. And sometimes I need to be the one that's doing the restoration as well of nature. I need to care for damaged places. And we just did an episode. Well, we just recorded an episode on this topic with a person who specializes in this kind of area. And what she said was helpful. She said it's not actually being in damaged nature that's the issue. It's people thinking about it, and that becomes the barrier. But when this person does retreats to damaged areas, as soon as people get to the place and begin to see it, they don't have that experience because they see the life and they see the place. Right. So some of this barrier about us reconnecting with nature is really, it's in our heads. Because once we're out, once we're with places, with trees, with animals in the woods, our natural curiosity and our natural, connections will come up. So it's just interesting to think about. So
how we perceive it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of a mental barrier.
And then we can also see that, nature restores itself over time.
Sure.
And, like watching the nature in the Columbia Gorge where we have the wildfires come back, and noticing that.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, that's not to deny that, things can't be dangerous in nature. Obviously, if you're in a severe storm, you want to take shelter and be careful. It doesn't mean being foolhardy or being naive. Obviously, if you're at the coast, you want to be careful of sneaker waves. And if you're in the mountains, you want to be careful of not getting lost and taking care of yourself. So there's a responsibility, obviously, that comes with being outdoors. So we don't want to confuse that. But that doesn't, we shouldn't withhold ourselves from our love for nature. We should get out and keep experiencing it.
Last question before I let you go. According to the research that I've read and news reports, children and teenagers are especially vulnerable to climate change related distress and anxiety. And I have a 5-year-old, and so I think about this a lot. And I'm wondering if you can briefly address what parents can do to help their children better process their emotions around this, because children also will see the news that their parents watch. My son saw the photos of fallen trees that destroyed houses because I had to work at home. So children are exposed to this, even if they're not watching the news all the time. They just hear about it because adults talk about it. So they're taking this stuff in. They know there's, stuff happening in nature, that the natural world is changing. And so how do we help them process that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I would say that, children and teens, I actually personally don't think they're more vulnerable than any other people. In my experience, people can be vulnerable to climate distress across the age spectrum, and that elders, now statistically, young people are slightly more concerned about climate when you look at public opinion polls, but it's only a statistical difference. The amount of concern for climate in the U.S. is fairly similar across all age groups, right? So we want to just kind of avoid that stereotype that young people are somehow more connected with nature than elders, because it's just not true. And I think children are both vulnerable in some ways, but they're also resilient. The nice thing about children is that they don't have the adult abstract thinking experiences that we have. They are much more in the moment. They see nature much more directly, and they can have much more fun. They don't necessarily make decisions or, label one nature place as good and one bad. They can enjoy a creek or do things because they're much more in the moment. And so that's something that's really helpful. And they have a shorter attention span, and they're easily, they can easily get entertained. So we can learn a lot from children, actually. And you can kind of get onto their level a little bit. It's kind of fun. And teens, can also be very inspiring because they see the world new, and they see injustice. They see things that don't make sense, and they're not afraid to speak out. So I think there's a lot of strength with young people. And yes, there's some vulnerabilities. Children can be very concrete in their thinking, very egocentric. So yes, I remember years ago with my daughter, who's 16 now, but when she was younger, during the Japanese Fukushima nuclear meltdown and tsunami that happened in Japan, we were watching it on the news. I think in real time the day it was happening, and she said, "When's the tsunami going to come to Portland?" Because that would be a very age appropriate question for a child to think. Well, if there's a tsunami, it's probably going to come here too. So young children can sometimes have difficulty separating themselves from global issues. So we have to reassure them and make sure they understand that just because something's happening, and you might not realize it. They might not ask you, but they may be taking this in. So you need to kind of do some proactive reassurance to say, when something's happening in another part of the world, that doesn't mean that it's not going to happen here. Kids want to know basic things. Am I going to be safe? How are we doing? And we can do some extra reassurance about that, because they might be picking up news that we're not aware of and kind of ruminating on it. And also teens, can be, they can be prone to, disillusionment and various things, and really understanding, helping them to sort of see that life is long, and there will be ways to work on things for a while, and to honor their values and to take action. So I think it's both. As a parent, we want to recognize the strength that our children have, and the joy and the specialness that they bring in, and then we want to kind of try to take care of some of the risks. So with young children, it's really about play, a connection with nature, active activities, concrete activities, and saving complex, environmental problem information till they're older. I think one of the sayings with it, is like no disasters before fourth grade or something like that. We really want to. We want to build a safe and healthy connection to nature with children first. That's the most important thing. And as an adult, if you didn't get that as a child, you can build it now. That's the other thing. It's never too late. So as a parent, as we parent, we can also put that energy to ourselves.
It's a good opportunity.
Well. Yeah.
to go out in nature. Well, thank you. This has been really a great conversation. I really appreciate it. And we're going to be following this topic closely in the future stories in the Oregonian and OregonLive.com. And I am going to be dropping a few links to some of the stories and podcasts we mentioned in the show notes of this show. So thank you so much for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. If you like this show, please give us a 5-star rating and review in Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find the show. The best way to support our journalism and stories like this is with a subscription to Oregon Live. You can do that at OregonLive.com/podsupport. Until next time, thank you.
Thanks, Kosha.